The sharp metallic taste hit my tongue immediately, followed by a burning sensation that made my throat constrict. I had only taken one small bite of Linda's famous lasagna, but something was terribly wrong. My stepmother sat across from me at our family dining table, her eyes fixed on my plate with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. She wasn't eating, she was watching. Waiting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That's when I realized what was happening. Linda had poisoned my food. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and I'm a 28-year-old graphic designer living in downtown Portland, Oregon. 3 months ago, my father Michael passed away suddenly from a heart attack, leaving behind a successful chain of Mexican-American restaurants and a family dynamic that had been poisonous long before Linda literally tried to poison me. The moment I tasted that metallic flavor, everything clicked into place. All those strange coincidences over the past few weeks suddenly made sense. The food poisoning I'd gotten after our last family dinner, the mysterious stomach bug that kept me from attending the reading of Dad's will, the migraine that hit me so hard during our business meeting that I had to leave early. Linda hadn't been showing concern for my health. She'd been systematically trying to make me sick. But what Linda didn't know was that I'd been expecting something like this for weeks. You see, my father had shared some disturbing suspicions with me before he died, and I'd been documenting everything ever since. The small recording device hidden in my purse was already running, and the tiny camera I'd installed in the dining room chandelier was capturing every moment of this dinner. I forced myself to swallow that one bite, then quickly excused myself to the bathroom. My hands were shaking as I triggered the emergency plan I'd hoped I'd never have to use. While Linda thought I was getting sicker upstairs, I was actually switching our plates. The lasagna she'd prepared specially for me was about to become her own meal. Linda had always been calculating, but she'd made one critical mistake. She underestimated me. The story of how we got to this moment begins 4 years ago, when Linda walked into our flagship restaurant on a rainy Tuesday evening. She was 42 then, 15 years younger than my father, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that seemed genuine until you looked closer at her eyes. She ordered the enchiladas made from my grandmother's secret recipe, the same dish my father had taught me to prepare when I was just 12 years old. Dad had been widowed for 8 years at that point. My mother, Isabella, had died in a car accident when I was 16. And in many ways, her death had brought Dad and me even closer together. We'd grieved together, rebuilt our lives together, and worked side by side to expand Rodriguez Family Kitchen, from a single location to 3 thriving restaurants across Portland. Those enchiladas weren't just food to us. They were a connection to our heritage, to my grandmother who'd immigrated from Guadalajara with nothing but her recipes and her dreams. Linda became a regular customer, always ordering the same dish, always sitting at table 7 in the corner where she could watch the kitchen. She'd compliment the food, ask questions about the ingredients, and gradually began engaging Dad in longer conversations. At first, I thought it was sweet. Dad had been lonely for so long, and seeing him smile again felt like a gift. Within 6 months, they were dating. Within a year, she'd moved into our family home in Beaverton, the same house where I'd grown up, where Mom's paintings still hung on the walls and her herb garden still bloomed every spring. Linda was subtle at first, making small suggestions about redecorating, mentioning how dated some of Mom's artwork looked, casually asking if we really needed to keep so many family photos displayed. I was 24 then, focused on building my freelance graphic design business and helping Dad modernize the restaurant's branding. I'd designed new menus, updated the website, and created social media campaigns that had doubled our customer base. The restaurants were thriving, and I assumed Dad's happiness with Linda was part of that success. The first red flag came during their engagement party. Linda had insisted on hosting it at the main restaurant, and she'd taken over all the planning. When I arrived that evening, I discovered she'd removed every trace of Mom's influence from the event. The mariachi band Dad had specifically requested was replaced with a jazz trio. The traditional Mexican decorations were swapped for generic, elegant centerpieces. Even the menu featured dishes that weren't part of our family recipes. When I pulled Dad aside to ask about the changes, he looked confused and slightly embarrassed. He told me Linda had convinced him that some of our traditions might seem too ethnic for her family and friends. The way he said it, with that apologetic tone, made my stomach turn. This was a man who'd built his entire business around celebrating our Mexican-American heritage, who'd taught me to be proud of our culture and our grandmother's legacy. But Linda had a way of making her suggestions seem reasonable, even caring. She'd couch her criticism in concern for Dad's health or business success. She worried that the spicy food might be too much for his aging digestion. She suggested that broadening the menu to include more American dishes would attract a wider customer base. She convinced him that working so many hours at the restaurants was affecting his blood pressure. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Linda began inserting herself into every aspect of our family business. She started showing up at staff meetings, offering input on hiring decisions and questioning our financial procedures. She had no restaurant experience, no business background, but she presented herself as Dad's partner in all things. When longtime employees would look to me for guidance, as they'd done for years, Linda would redirect them to speak with her first. The changes accelerated after their wedding. Linda pushed Dad to hire her son Tyler as an assistant manager, despite his complete lack of experience in food service. She convinced him to let her daughter Madison redesign our website, even though I'd been handling all our digital marketing successfully for years. Every family recipe that made our restaurant special suddenly needed to be documented and improved under Linda's supervision. I watched helplessly as Linda systematically began erasing my family's legacy while positioning herself and her children as the rightful heirs to everything Dad had built. She was clever about it, always framing her actions as being in Dad's best interest or for the good of the business. When I tried to voice concerns, she'd respond with hurt feelings and accusations that I wasn't being supportive of Dad's new marriage. The breaking point came 6 months ago, during what should have been a routine business meeting. Dad had called me to the restaurant to discuss expanding our catering services, something we'd been planning together for months. When I arrived, I found Linda sitting in my usual seat at Dad's desk, with Tyler and Madison flanking her on either side. Dad looked uncomfortable as Linda explained that they'd decided the family should have more input in major business decisions. For the next 2 hours, I watched Linda systematically dismantle every expansion plan Dad and I had developed. She questioned the financial projections I'd prepared, suggested that my marketing strategies were too narrow, and proposed that Tyler should head the new catering division instead of me. She presented detailed arguments about why the business needed younger leadership and fresh perspectives, never directly saying I was too old or set in my ways, but implying it constantly. Dad sat quietly through most of the meeting, occasionally nodding when Linda looked at him for support. This was the same man who'd taught me to stand up for myself, who'd raised me to be confident and independent, who'd always treated me as his equal partner in business. Now he was deferring to a woman who'd been in our lives for less than 4 years and had no understanding of what we'd built together. That night, I went home to my downtown apartment and cried harder than I had since Mom's funeral. I felt like I was losing Dad while he was still alive, watching him disappear into Linda's web of manipulation and control. The restaurants that had been our shared passion were becoming foreign to me, filled with new faces who looked to Linda for direction instead of the family who'd created everything they depended on. I started paying closer attention after that meeting, documenting the changes Linda was making and the way she spoke about me when she thought I wasn't listening. I kept detailed records of every conversation, every decision that excluded me, every instance where Linda positioned herself as the true power behind Dad's success. I didn't know what I was preparing for, but something deep in my gut told me I was going to need evidence of what was really happening. 3 weeks before Dad's heart attack, he called me late one evening, asking if I could meet him at the original restaurant location after closing time. His voice sounded strained, worried in a way I hadn't heard since Mom's accident. When I arrived, I found him sitting alone at the bar, staring at a stack of financial documents spread across the surface. He told me he'd discovered some discrepancies in the restaurant accounts, transfers that he hadn't authorized, and expenses that didn't match any purchases he remembered approving. Linda had been managing more of the day-to-day finances lately, taking that burden off his shoulders, as she'd put it, But now he was questioning whether that had been wise. There were credit card charges for expensive dinners at competitors' restaurants, consulting fees paid to companies he'd never heard of, and equipment purchases that had never been delivered. More disturbing were the changes Linda had been making to official business documents without his knowledge. She'd added herself as a signatory on several accounts, and had begun inquiring about transferring ownership stakes to her children. When Dad confronted her about these changes, she'd become defensive and accused him of not trusting her after everything she'd done for the family business. Dad looked exhausted as he shared these concerns with me. He admitted that he had been feeling overwhelmed by Linda's constant input and suggestions, that he missed the simpler dynamic we'd shared when it was just the two of us running the restaurants. He'd started to suspect that Linda's interest in him was more financial than romantic, but he felt trapped by their marriage and the changes she'd already implemented. That conversation haunts me now because it was the last honest discussion Dad and I ever had. 3 weeks later, he collapsed in the kitchen of our main location during the lunch rush. The paramedics said his heart attack was massive and sudden, likely caused by years of stress and high blood pressure. Linda played the devastated widow perfectly, sobbing at his bedside, and making sure everyone knew how much she'd sacrificed to take care of his legacy. But I noticed things that others missed. The way Linda's grief seemed performative when people were watching, but disappeared when she thought she was alone. How quickly she began making plans for funeral arrangements that eliminated many of Dad's longtime friends and business associates. The subtle ways she positioned herself as the primary decision-maker for everything related to Dad's estate and the restaurants. The day after Dad's funeral, Linda called a family meeting at the house. She sat in Dad's favorite chair in the living room, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements, and explained how things were going to change. According to the will she presented, Dad had left the majority of his estate to her, with smaller portions allocated to Tyler and Madison. The restaurants would be sold, she announced, because managing them was too much responsibility for someone dealing with such profound grief. I sat in stunned silence as Linda described her plans to liquidate everything Dad had spent 30 years building. The money from the sale would allow her to move somewhere warmer, maybe Florida, where she could start fresh and heal from her loss. Tyler and Madison nodded along supportively, clearly aware of these plans in advance. I was the only one who seemed shocked by this complete abandonment of Dad's legacy. When I asked to see the will Linda was referencing, she became evasive and defensive. She claimed the original was with Dad's lawyer, and that I'd receive my copy in due time. She assured me that Dad had been very specific about his wishes, that he'd wanted to ensure she was taken care of after everything she'd given up to be part of our family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The way she said it made it clear that my objections weren't welcome. That night, I called David Chen, the lawyer who'd handled our family's legal affairs for over a decade. David had been a friend of Dad's since college and had drafted the original will that left everything to me, with provisions for Linda's care but not ownership. When I described the will Linda had presented, David's voice grew tight with concern. He told me that Dad had never contacted him about making changes to his estate planning, and that the document Linda described didn't match anything in his files. David advised me to be very careful and to document everything Linda said or did regarding the estate. He suspected that Linda might be presenting fraudulent documents, but proving that would require time and careful investigation. In the meantime, he recommended that I avoid confronting her directly and instead gather evidence of her deception. That's when I began my systematic documentation of Linda's behavior. I installed discreet recording devices in the family home and restaurants, always in public areas where there was no expectation of privacy. I photographed every document Linda showed me and forwarded copies to David for analysis. I began recording our conversations and keeping detailed logs of every suspicious statement or action. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Linda was systematically isolating me from the business operations, while positioning her children as the legitimate heirs to Dad's legacy. She was spreading stories among the restaurant staff about my emotional instability following Dad's death, suggesting that I wasn't capable of handling business responsibilities during my grief. She painted herself as the strong widow, holding everything together while protecting me from additional stress. Linda's manipulation was sophisticated and calculated. She never directly accused me of anything, or made obvious threats. Instead, she created doubt about my competence and reliability, while presenting herself as the responsible adult making difficult decisions for everyone's benefit. Staff members who'd known me for years began treating me differently, offering condolences for losses beyond Dad's death, as if Linda had convinced them I was falling apart. The financial irregularities Dad had discovered before his death continued to multiply under Linda's management. Money was being transferred out of business accounts at an alarming rate, always with explanations about necessary expenses or emergency repairs. Equipment was being sold and replaced with cheaper alternatives, with Linda pocketing the difference. She was systematically draining the restaurant's assets while preparing to sell them far below their actual value to buyers who were likely her associates. 2 months after Dad's death, I finally received what Linda claimed was my copy of the will. The document was obviously fraudulent, filled with legal language that didn't match Dad's speaking style and provisions that contradicted everything I knew about his wishes. David confirmed that the signature was forged and that several legal requirements for valid will execution were missing. We had grounds to contest Linda's claims, but she'd already done significant damage to the business assets. That's when Linda's behavior became more aggressive. She began making comments about my mental health, suggesting to family friends that I was having trouble accepting Dad's death and the changes he'd wanted for the business. She portrayed my legal challenges as the desperate actions of a daughter who couldn't accept her father's final wishes. She even convinced some of Dad's oldest friends that I was being selfish and ungrateful. The attacks became more personal and direct. Linda would make cutting remarks about my appearance, my career choices, and my inability to maintain the kind of relationship that Dad had found with her. She suggested that my single status at 28 indicated some fundamental flaw in my character, that perhaps Dad had worried about my ability to carry on his legacy alone. Every conversation became an opportunity for her to undermine my confidence and credibility. But the most insidious part of Linda's campaign was how she began affecting my physical health. It started with stomach problems after family dinners, which I initially attributed to stress and grief. Then came the mysterious headaches that would strike during important business meetings, forcing me to leave early and miss crucial discussions. I'd wake up feeling dizzy and nauseous on days when I had scheduled meetings with lawyers or accountants. The pattern was so subtle that I might have missed it if not for one crucial detail. The symptoms only occurred after eating food that Linda had prepared or served. Restaurant meals with staff were fine. Dinners at friends' houses caused no problems. But family gatherings at the house, where Linda insisted on cooking for everyone, consistently left me feeling ill. 3 weeks ago, I finally decided to test my suspicions. I arranged for a friend to follow me to Sunday dinner and wait outside the house. If I didn't text within 2 hours, she was to call 911 and tell them I suspected poisoning. I also swallowed a small GPS tracking device that would allow medical professionals to monitor my location if I lost consciousness. That dinner confirmed my worst fears. Linda served her famous lasagna, making a show of how she'd prepared my portion specially because she knew it was one of my favorites. Within minutes of eating, I felt the familiar onset of nausea and dizziness. But this time, I was prepared. I excused myself to the bathroom and triggered my emergency protocol, texting my friend and taking photos of my symptoms. The next morning, blood tests confirmed the presence of small amounts of prescription medications that I'd never taken. David connected me with a toxicologist who explained that Linda had likely been giving me doses too small to cause immediate danger, but large enough to make me sick and potentially affect my cognitive function during important meetings. It was a sophisticated form of poisoning designed to undermine my credibility rather than kill me outright. Armed with this evidence, David and I developed a plan to catch Linda in the act. We would arrange one more family dinner, but this time I would be prepared with recording equipment and a strategy to document her confession. The plan was risky, because it required me to potentially expose myself to more poisoning, but it was the only way to gather the evidence we needed to stop her permanently. Which brings us back to tonight. Sitting at the family dining table with Linda's poisoned lasagna in front of me. I've taken one bite, just enough to confirm the metallic taste that indicates she's escalated her dosing. Now I'm upstairs in the bathroom, switching the plates while Linda waits downstairs for me to become sick enough to miss tomorrow's crucial meeting with the probate court. But this time, Linda's going to be the one getting sick. And this time, I'm going to be recording when she confesses to everything she's done. The transformation of our family dynamic didn't happen overnight. Linda was far too clever for such obvious manipulation. Instead, she orchestrated a slow, methodical campaign that eroded the foundation of everything Dad and I had built together. Looking back now, I can see exactly how she did it, but at the time each individual change seemed reasonable, even caring. The first major shift came 6 months after their wedding, when Linda suggested that Sunday family dinners should become a regular tradition. She presented it as a way to strengthen our family bonds and give Dad something to look forward to each week. The idea seemed wonderful at first. Dad had been working long hours at the restaurants, and I'd been buried in client projects for my design business. Having a guaranteed time each week to reconnect felt like exactly what we needed. Linda insisted on hosting these dinners at the family home, claiming she wanted to create a warm, welcoming atmosphere that would help us all feel closer. She'd spend hours preparing elaborate meals, always featuring dishes that weren't part of our usual family recipes. When I offered to bring something or help with the cooking, she'd wave me away with a bright smile, insisting that I worked too hard during the week and deserved to be pampered. At first, I appreciated her efforts. The meals were delicious, and Dad seemed genuinely happy to have the whole family gathered around the dining room table where he'd shared so many meals with Mom and me over the years. Linda would ask thoughtful questions about my work, seem genuinely interested in the restaurant's daily operations, and always made sure Dad felt like the center of attention. But subtle changes began appearing in these conversations. Linda would casually mention articles she'd read about the restaurant industry, always focusing on negative trends or concerning statistics. She'd bring up stories about family businesses that had failed because they couldn't adapt to changing markets. She'd wonder aloud whether Dad was working too hard for his age, whether the stress of managing 3 locations was affecting his health. These concerns always sounded loving and reasonable. What wife wouldn't worry about her husband's well-being? What stepmother wouldn't want to ensure the family business remained sustainable for future generations? But I began to notice that Linda's questions and comments consistently planted seeds of doubt about our current operations and my role in the business. The conversations would follow a predictable pattern. Linda would express concern about some aspect of the restaurants. Dad would acknowledge the validity of her worry, and then she'd suggest that perhaps Tyler or Madison could help address the issue. Her children were always presented as solutions to problems that Linda had identified, never as additions to a functioning system. Tyler was 26, 2 years younger than me, with a college degree in communications and no practical work experience. He'd bounced between several entry-level jobs since graduation, never staying anywhere longer than 8 months. But Linda consistently portrayed him as ambitious and eager to contribute to the family business. She'd mention his ideas for improving customer service or his observations about restaurant trends he'd noticed while dining at other establishments. Madison was 24, fresh out of college with a degree in marketing. She'd completed exactly 1 internship at a small advertising agency before moving back home to live with Linda and Dad. Yet Linda spoke about her as if she were a seasoned professional with insights that could revolutionize our marketing approach. She'd reference Madison's understanding of social media trends and her connections with younger demographics that we allegedly weren't reaching effectively. Meanwhile, my contributions to the family business were increasingly minimized or questioned. Linda would listen politely when I discussed successful marketing campaigns I'd implemented, then wonder aloud whether we might benefit from a fresh perspective. She'd acknowledge my hard work on menu design and branding, then suggest that perhaps it was time to consider whether our current image was still relevant to modern consumers. The most insidious part of Linda's strategy was how she positioned these suggestions. She never directly criticized my work or explicitly stated that Tyler and Madison were more qualified than me. Instead, she framed everything in terms of supporting Dad and ensuring the business remained competitive. She presented her children's involvement as a way to reduce Dad's workload and stress, not as a replacement for my contributions. Dad, who had always been decisive and confident in business matters, began second-guessing decisions we'd made together. He'd ask for Linda's opinion on matters that had never required external input before. He'd want to discuss staffing changes or menu modifications with her before implementing them, even though she had no experience in restaurant management. I watched our weekly staff meetings transform from collaborative discussions between Dad and me into complicated negotiations that included Linda's input on every decision. She'd arrive at the restaurant during these meetings, ostensibly to check on Dad or bring him lunch, but somehow she'd end up participating in conversations about scheduling, inventory management, and customer service policies. Linda had a talent for asking questions that sounded innocent but actually challenged the wisdom of our established practices. She'd wonder whether our portion sizes were too generous, cutting into profit margins unnecessarily. She'd question whether our staff scheduling was efficient, suggesting that we might be overstaffed during certain shifts. She'd mention restaurant management courses that Tyler had been taking online, implying that he was gaining expertise that could benefit our operations. The changes escalated when Linda convinced Dad that the family business needed more formal structure and professional management. She argued that running 3 restaurants required corporate-level organization, and that our informal approach, while charming, wasn't sustainable for long-term growth. She suggested hiring a business consultant to evaluate our operations and recommend improvements. The consultant Linda recommended turned out to be a friend of hers from her previous job, a woman named Patricia, who specialized in restaurant acquisitions and sales. Patricia spent 2 weeks observing our operations, interviewing staff members, and analyzing our financial records. Her final report painted a picture of a family business that was successful but inefficient, profitable but lacking the professional management structure needed for expansion or long-term sustainability. Patricia's recommendations read like a blueprint for Linda's takeover of the business. She suggested implementing formal management hierarchies, with Linda overseeing operations and Tyler managing day-to-day restaurant functions. She recommended updating our marketing approach under Madison's direction and gradually transitioning away from what she called our ethnic focus to appeal to broader demographic markets. The report questioned whether our grandmother's traditional recipes were still relevant to modern consumers and suggested menu modifications that would reduce food costs while increasing appeal to mainstream American tastes. It recommended updating our restaurant decor to eliminate what Patricia described as overly cultural elements that might limit our customer base. Reading that report felt like watching someone systematically dismantle everything that made our restaurants special. Our Mexican-American heritage wasn't a limitation to overcome. It was our strength, our identity, the foundation of everything we'd built. Our grandmother's recipes weren't outdated traditions. They were the heart of our success, the reason customers traveled across Portland to eat at Rodriguez Family Kitchen. But Linda presented Patricia's recommendations as professional expertise that we'd be foolish to ignore. She emphasized the consultant's credentials and experience, suggesting that emotional attachment to tradition might be preventing us from seeing opportunities for improvement. She framed resistance to these changes as stubbornness, rather than legitimate concern about losing our identity. Dad seemed torn between his loyalty to our family traditions and his trust in Linda's judgment. He'd built his business by honoring his mother's recipes and celebrating Mexican-American culture, but Linda's arguments about professional management and market expansion appealed to his desire for continued success. He began asking me to consider whether some of Patricia's suggestions might have merit, whether we might benefit from making gradual changes to stay competitive. The pressure to conform to Linda's vision intensified during our Sunday dinners. She'd bring up restaurant industry articles she'd found online, always focusing on stories about traditional family businesses that had successfully modernized their operations. She'd share examples of restaurants that had increased profits by streamlining their menus or updating their marketing approaches. These conversations always included subtle criticism of our current practices, delivered with expressions of concern rather than direct attack. Linda would worry that we were working too hard for the profits we generated, that we weren't maximizing our potential because we were too attached to old-fashioned methods. She'd suggest that Dad deserved to enjoy the success he'd built, rather than continuing to work such long hours maintaining traditions that might no longer serve the business well. Tyler and Madison began appearing at these dinners with increasingly detailed suggestions for restaurant improvements. Tyler would share ideas he'd learned in his online management courses, always positioning them as ways to help Dad reduce his workload. Madison would present social media strategies and marketing concepts that could expand our customer base beyond our current demographic. Their suggestions consistently involved reducing or eliminating the cultural elements that defined our restaurants. Tyler proposed replacing mariachi music with contemporary jazz to create a more sophisticated atmosphere, Madison suggested modifying our menu descriptions to use less Spanish language, making them more accessible to customers who might feel intimidated by unfamiliar terms. They never explicitly stated that our Mexican-American identity was a problem, but their suggestions consistently moved us toward a more generic, mainstream restaurant concept. They presented these changes as necessary adaptations to changing market conditions, not as abandonment of our heritage. I found myself increasingly isolated during these family discussions. When I defended our traditional practices or questioned the wisdom of Linda's suggested changes, I was positioned as resistant to progress, too emotionally attached to the past to see opportunities for improvement. Linda would listen to my concerns with apparent sympathy, then gently suggest that grief over losing Dad might be making it harder for me to embrace necessary changes. The gaslighting was sophisticated and relentless. Linda never directly contradicted my memories or experiences, but she consistently offered alternative interpretations that cast doubt on my perceptions. When I mentioned conversations Dad and I had shared about preserving our family traditions, Linda would wonder whether Dad's illness might have made him more sentimental than usual. When I referenced successful marketing campaigns we'd implemented together, she'd suggest that market conditions had changed since then, making our previous approaches less effective. Dad's behavior during these conversations became increasingly painful to witness. He'd nod along with Linda's suggestions, ask Tyler and Madison thoughtful questions about their ideas, and treat my objections as obstacles to overcome rather than legitimate concerns from his business partner. The man who had taught me to stand up for my beliefs and trust my instincts was deferring to people who had no understanding of what we'd built together. The breaking point in our family dynamic came during a Sunday dinner, 8 months before Dad's heart attack. Linda had prepared what she called a celebration meal to mark Tyler's completion of his restaurant management certification program. She'd made his favorite dishes and invited several of her friends to join us for dinner, presenting it as a family milestone worthy of recognition. During the meal, Linda announced that Dad had agreed to promote Tyler to assistant manager at our flagship location, giving him oversight of daily operations and staff scheduling. The decision had been made without consulting me, despite my role as Dad's business partner and my years of experience managing restaurant operations. Linda presented it as a natural progression that would allow Dad to focus on bigger picture planning while ensuring the restaurants benefited from Tyler's fresh training. Tyler accepted congratulations from Linda's friends with obvious pride, discussing his plans for improving efficiency and implementing new customer service protocols. He spoke about our restaurants as if they were case studies from his coursework rather than family businesses, with decades of history and established relationships with staff and customers. When I questioned the wisdom of putting someone with no practical restaurant experience in charge of daily operations, Linda responded with hurt surprise, wondering why I wasn't more supportive of Dad's decision to bring younger energy into the business. She suggested that my resistance might stem from feeling threatened by Tyler's education and certification, implying that my objections were based on insecurity rather than legitimate business concerns. Dad sat quietly during this exchange, occasionally nodding when Linda looked to him for support but avoiding direct eye contact with me. This was the man who had taught me that respect must be earned through hard work and dedication, who had insisted that I prove myself at every level of the business before taking on additional responsibilities. Now he was handing significant authority to someone whose only qualification was completing an online certification program. That night, I drove home to my apartment feeling like I'd lost my father while he was still alive. The restaurants that had been our shared passion were being transformed into something unrecognizable, and Dad seemed powerless to resist Linda's systematic takeover. I sat in my car outside my building for over an hour, crying and wondering whether I should start looking for a way out of the family business before Linda pushed me out entirely. The next few months confirmed my worst fears about Tyler's promotion. He implemented changes that prioritized cost-cutting over quality, modified recipes to use cheaper ingredients, and treated longtime staff members like replaceable resources rather than valued team members. Customer complaints increased as portion sizes decreased and familiar flavors changed. Several employees who had worked for us for years began asking me privately whether the restaurants were in financial trouble, because the changes Tyler was making suggested desperate cost-cutting measures. Meanwhile, Madison took over more of our marketing responsibilities, gradually phasing out the cultural elements that had defined our brand identity. She updated our website to feature generic food photography instead of images of our specific dishes. She changed our social media approach to focus on trendy food presentation rather than family recipes and cultural heritage. She convinced Dad to update our restaurant decor, removing artwork and decorations that she claimed looked dated and unprofessional. Linda celebrated these changes as evidence of successful modernization, but I watched our customer base slowly shift away from the families and individuals who had supported us for years toward more transient diners attracted by Madison's generic marketing approach. Our restaurants were becoming profitable in the short term, but losing the loyal community relationships that had sustained us through economic downturns and competitive challenges. The most devastating change was what happened to our signature enchilada recipe, the dish that had built our reputation and connected us to our grandmother's legacy. Tyler decided that the traditional preparation method was too time-intensive for efficient kitchen operations. He modified the recipe to use pre-made sauce and simplified seasoning, reducing preparation time but eliminating the complex flavors that had made the dish special. When regular customers began commenting that our enchiladas tasted different, Tyler dismissed their concerns as resistance to change rather than legitimate feedback about declining quality. He argued that most diners wouldn't notice the modifications and that the time savings allowed kitchen staff to prepare more orders during busy periods, increasing overall profits. I watched Dad taste the modified enchiladas during a family dinner, saw the disappointment in his eyes as he recognized how far the dish had drifted from his mother's original recipe. But when Linda praised Tyler's innovation and efficiency improvements, Dad nodded along rather than acknowledging what we both knew, that we were betraying the foundation of everything our family had built. Linda's strategy reached its culmination 6 months before Dad's death, when she convinced him to begin transition planning that would gradually transfer business ownership to her children. She presented this as estate planning that would ensure smooth business continuity and protect the family's financial security. She argued that formal succession planning was responsible management that would prevent conflicts and legal complications if anything happened to Dad. The succession plan Linda proposed essentially wrote me out of the business I'd helped build. Tyler would inherit operational control of all 3 restaurants, while Madison would own the marketing and branding assets. Linda would maintain oversight as the primary shareholder, ensuring that business decisions aligned with the family's best interests. I would receive a small percentage of profits as recognition for my past contributions, but no decision-making authority or ownership stake. When I objected to this arrangement, pointing out that I'd been Dad's business partner for over a decade and had contributed significantly to our success, Linda responded with apparent concern for my well-being. She worried that continuing to work in the family business might be preventing me from pursuing independent opportunities that would allow me to build my own legacy rather than living in Dad's shadow. She suggested that accepting a consulting role rather than ownership position would give me freedom to develop my graphic design business while still maintaining family connections. She framed my resistance to this arrangement as clinging to the past rather than embracing opportunities for personal growth and independence. Dad struggled with these conversations in ways that were painful to witness. He'd built the restaurants as a legacy for me, had taught me every aspect of the business with the expectation that I would eventually take over operations. But Linda's arguments about professional succession planning and family harmony seemed to override his original intentions. He began treating our shared history as sentiment rather than legitimate preparation for business leadership. The most heartbreaking part was watching Dad doubt his own judgment about my capabilities and contributions. Linda's constant suggestions that I might be happier pursuing independent opportunities gradually convinced him that keeping me in the family business might be holding me back, rather than honoring our partnership. He started asking whether I really wanted to spend my life managing restaurants, or whether I had other dreams I'd been sacrificing for family obligations. These conversations revealed how completely Linda had manipulated Dad's understanding of our relationship and my commitment to our shared work. She'd convinced him that my dedication to the restaurants was obligation rather than passion, that my desire to preserve our family traditions was resistance to change rather than commitment to our values. The final blow came when Linda suggested that transitioning business ownership to Tyler and Madison would actually be a gift to me, freeing me from responsibilities that were preventing me from finding a husband and starting my own family. She worried that working so closely with Dad might be making it difficult for me to establish independent adult relationships, that potential partners might be intimidated by my strong family ties and business commitments. This argument was particularly cruel because Linda knew how much I valued my relationship with Dad and my role in our family business. She was suggesting that the things I was most proud of were actually obstacles to personal happiness, that success meant abandoning everything I'd worked to build. By the time Dad suffered his heart attack, Linda had successfully isolated me from meaningful participation in business decisions, while positioning her children as the rightful heirs to everything we'd created together. She'd convinced Dad that this arrangement served everyone's best interests, that it would allow him to retire gradually while ensuring business continuity and family harmony. The tragedy is that Dad died believing he was protecting me by reducing my business responsibilities, never realizing that Linda had manipulated him into abandoning the succession plans we'd discussed for years. He thought he was giving me freedom to pursue independent happiness, not understanding that he was actually stealing the legacy we'd built together and handing it to people who had no appreciation for what it represented. Standing in the bathroom now, preparing to return downstairs with our switched plates, I think about how Dad would feel if he knew what Linda was doing to me. The woman he'd trusted with his love and his business was literally poisoning his daughter, systematically destroying everything he'd worked to build while pretending to honor his memory. But Linda had made one crucial mistake in her long campaign of manipulation and control. She'd underestimated my intelligence, my determination, and my commitment to preserving what Dad and I had created together. She thought she'd successfully isolated me and undermined my credibility. She had no idea that I'd been documenting her behavior and preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Tonight, Linda was going to discover that poisoning me was the worst decision she'd ever made. And I was going to make sure she confessed to everything. The moment I suspected Linda was drugging me, everything changed. What had been growing unease and frustration transformed into cold, calculated determination. If Linda wanted to play games with my health and my future, she was about to discover that I was far more prepared for this battle than she could possibly imagine. The first step was confirming my suspicions with hard evidence. I couldn't make accusations based on feelings or coincidences, no matter how strong my intuition. I needed proof that would stand up in court and convince authorities that Linda was systematically poisoning me. This meant documenting everything while protecting myself from further harm. I started by reaching out to Dr. Sarah Martinez, a physician who had been treating our family for years and had known Dad since college. Dr. Martinez had always been straightforward and practical, someone who wouldn't dismiss my concerns as paranoia or grief-induced imagination. When I called her office requesting an urgent appointment, she cleared her schedule to see me that same afternoon. Sitting in her consultation room, I explained my suspicions about Linda's behavior and the pattern of illnesses that coincided with family dinners. Dr. Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes but never showing doubt or skepticism. When I finished describing my symptoms and their timing, she leaned back in her chair with a serious expression. Her first recommendation was immediate blood and urine testing to check for foreign substances in my system. She explained that many common medications and toxic substances could be detected days or even weeks after ingestion, depending on the dosage and frequency of exposure. She also suggested hair follicle testing, which could reveal substance exposure over a longer time period. Dr. Martinez referred me to a toxicologist she trusted, Dr. James Wong, who specialized in poisoning cases and had experience working with law enforcement on criminal investigations. She emphasized the importance of maintaining detailed records of any future symptoms and avoiding situations where Linda could tamper with my food or drinks. The toxicology results confirmed my worst fears. Dr. Wong found traces of several prescription medications in my system, including sedatives and anti-anxiety drugs that I'd never been prescribed. The concentrations were carefully calibrated, high enough to cause symptoms like dizziness, nausea, and cognitive impairment, but low enough to avoid immediate medical emergency or obvious signs of overdose. Dr. Wong explained that this type of poisoning required sophisticated knowledge of pharmaceutical effects and dosing. Linda wasn't randomly dumping pills into my food. She was systematically administering specific medications in calculated amounts designed to undermine my mental clarity and physical well-being without causing symptoms dramatic enough to prompt immediate medical attention. The sophistication of Linda's approach suggested she'd done research or had experience with these substances. Dr. Wong recommended investigating Linda's background to determine whether she had medical training, pharmaceutical knowledge, or history of similar behavior. He also provided me with testing kits that would allow me to check food and drinks for contamination before consuming them. Armed with medical evidence of poisoning, I contacted David Chen to discuss legal implications and strategy. David had been skeptical when I first raised concerns about Linda's behavior, but the toxicology reports transformed his attitude completely. He immediately recognized that we were dealing with serious criminal activity that went far beyond estate fraud or business manipulation. David explained that poisoning cases were complex legal matters requiring careful evidence collection and coordination with law enforcement. Simply proving that Linda had drugged me wouldn't be sufficient to stop her long-term plans for the business and estate. We needed evidence of her broader criminal enterprise, including the forged will, financial fraud, and systematic deception she'd been conducting since Dad's death. He recommended a comprehensive investigation strategy that would document Linda's criminal activity while gathering evidence for both civil and criminal legal proceedings. This meant conducting surveillance, recording conversations, and building a case that would not only stop Linda's immediate threats, but also recover the assets she'd stolen and ensure she faced appropriate criminal consequences. David connected me with Rebecca Torres, a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes and family disputes. Rebecca had extensive experience working with families dealing with inheritance fraud and had developed expertise in documenting complex manipulation schemes. She understood the psychological dynamics of cases like mine and knew how to gather evidence without alerting the perpetrator to the investigation. Rebecca's first step was conducting a thorough background investigation of Linda and her children. What we discovered was more disturbing than I'd imagined. Linda had a history of targeting wealthy older men, establishing relationships that always ended with significant financial benefit for her. She'd been married twice before Dad, both times to successful businessmen who died within 5 years of their weddings. Her first husband had owned a successful auto dealership that was sold shortly after his death from what was ruled a heart attack. Linda inherited the majority of his estate, despite having been married to him for only 3 years. Her second husband had been a retired engineer with substantial savings in real estate investments that Linda inherited after he died, in what appeared to be an accidental fall at their home. In both cases, Linda's behavior followed similar patterns to what I'd observed with Dad. She'd gradually isolated her husbands from their adult children and longtime friends, convinced them to modify their estate planning in her favor, and positioned herself as their primary caregiver and advocate. She'd systematically undermined the relationships between these men and their biological children, while promoting her own children as deserving heirs. Rebecca discovered that Linda had used different variations of her name in previous relationships, making it difficult to trace her complete history. She'd also moved frequently, always relocating after her husband's deaths to new cities where she could establish fresh identities and avoid scrutiny from suspicious family members or investigators. Tyler and Madison had been complicit in their mother's schemes, though the extent of their involvement varied. Tyler had helped manage financial transactions and estate settlements, while Madison had focused on social media and digital manipulation designed to control information and isolate Linda's targets from potential allies. The pattern Rebecca uncovered suggested that Linda's approach to Dad and our family wasn't opportunistic romance gone wrong, but calculated criminal enterprise. She'd targeted Dad specifically because of his successful business and his vulnerability as a widower. She'd researched our family dynamics and business operations before ever setting foot in our restaurant. This revelation transformed my understanding of everything that had happened over the past 4 years. Linda's initial charm and apparent interest in our family wasn't genuine affection. It was reconnaissance. Her suggestions about business improvements and succession planning weren't misguided interference. They were deliberate sabotage designed to position her children as Dad's heirs while undermining my role in the family business. With Rebecca's investigation providing broader context, David and I developed a comprehensive strategy for documenting Linda's current criminal activity. We needed evidence that would support charges for poisoning, inheritance fraud, business fraud, and conspiracy. This required careful coordination between multiple types of evidence collection while avoiding any actions that might alert Linda to our investigation. The surveillance operation began with installing discrete recording equipment in areas where Linda was likely to incriminate herself. Rebecca recommended focusing on locations where Linda felt comfortable and secure, places where she might speak openly about her plans or reveal information about her criminal activity. We placed tiny recording devices in the family home's common areas, including the living room where Linda often spoke on the phone and the kitchen where she prepared food for family dinners. We also installed a hidden camera in the dining room that would capture dinner conversations and Linda's behavior while serving meals. Rebecca emphasized the importance of staying within legal boundaries for surveillance. All recording equipment was placed in common areas where there was no expectation of privacy, and we avoided any surveillance of bedrooms, bathrooms, or other private spaces. We also ensured that any recorded conversations included my participation, making them legally admissible evidence. The most challenging aspect of the surveillance operation was maintaining normal behavior while documenting Linda's criminal activity. I had to continue attending family dinners and business meetings, acting as if I hadn't discovered her poisoning scheme while secretly recording our interactions. This required careful preparation and emotional control that was exhausting to maintain. Dr. Wong provided me with discrete testing materials that would allow me to check food and drinks for contamination without Linda's knowledge. These tests were designed to look like normal seasoning or condiment packets, allowing me to test my meals during dinner conversations without arousing suspicion. I also began carrying a small recording device that looked like a normal smartphone accessory, ensuring that any conversation with Linda would be documented. Rebecca taught me techniques for guiding conversations toward topics that might prompt Linda to reveal incriminating information about her plans or past actions. The evidence we collected over the following weeks painted a detailed picture of Linda's criminal enterprise. The recordings captured her speaking with Tyler and Madison about accelerating their timeline for selling the restaurants and liquidating Dad's estate. She expressed frustration about my continued involvement in business operations and discussed strategies for undermining my credibility with staff members and business associates. Most damning were conversations where Linda discussed my health symptoms with apparent satisfaction, referring to my frequent illnesses as convenient obstacles to my participation in important business decisions. She made comments about hoping my symptoms would worsen enough to convince people that I was having serious mental health problems related to Dad's death. The surveillance also captured Linda speaking with unknown individuals about property appraisals and business valuations, suggesting she was preparing to sell Dad's assets far below market value to associates who would compensate her privately for the difference. These conversations revealed a sophisticated fraud scheme that involved multiple accomplices and would have resulted in millions of dollars in stolen assets. Rebecca's investigation expanded to include financial analysis of Linda's activities since Dad's death. We discovered evidence of unauthorized transfers from business accounts, fraudulent expense claims, and manipulation of business records designed to hide assets and reduce the apparent value of Dad's estate. Linda had been systematically draining money from the restaurants while preparing to abandon them entirely. The financial evidence supported criminal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Combined with the medical evidence of poisoning and the recorded conversations documenting her criminal plans, we had built a comprehensive case that would ensure Linda faced serious legal consequences while protecting Dad's estate and business from further damage. But building a legal case was only part of our strategy. David and I also developed plans for protecting the business operations and staff members who depended on the restaurants for their livelihoods. We needed to ensure that exposing Linda's crimes wouldn't result in business disruption that would harm innocent employees and customers. This required careful coordination with business managers and key staff members who had been questioning Linda's recent changes to restaurant operations. We identified employees who had expressed concerns about cost-cutting measures and quality reductions, people who might serve as witnesses to Linda's mismanagement, and support efforts to restore proper business practices. David also began preparing legal documents that would restore my rightful position in the business and reverse the unauthorized changes Linda had implemented. This included challenging the fraudulent will she'd presented and documenting the legitimate estate planning documents Dad had created with David's assistance over the years. The complexity of our legal strategy required coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies and court systems. The poisoning charges would be handled by local criminal prosecutors, while the financial fraud would involve federal investigators specializing in white-collar crime. The estate disputes would proceed through probate court, requiring different evidence and legal procedures. Throughout this preparation process, I maintained my normal routine while secretly documenting Linda's escalating criminal behavior. The stress of this double life was enormous, requiring constant vigilance and emotional control while dealing with ongoing health threats and business pressures. The most difficult aspect was watching Linda continue to manipulate Dad's memory and legacy while planning to destroy everything he'd built. She would speak about Dad with apparent affection during public conversations, then privately discuss her plans to eliminate all traces of our family's heritage from the restaurants she intended to sell. Her conversations with Tyler and Madison revealed complete contempt for Dad's values and our family traditions. She referred to our cultural heritage as marketing gimmicks that limited business potential, and described our loyal customers as unsophisticated people who didn't understand modern restaurant trends. These recordings were personally devastating, but legally valuable. They demonstrated Linda's true motivations and contradicted the grieving widow persona she maintained in public. They also revealed the extent of Tyler and Madison's involvement in planning to defraud Dad's estate and destroy his business legacy. As our evidence collection continued, Linda's behavior became more aggressive and desperate. She increased the frequency and dosage of substances she was putting in my food, apparently hoping to cause symptoms serious enough to justify claims about my declining mental health. She also began spreading rumors among business associates about my emotional instability and unreliability. The escalation in Linda's criminal activity created both opportunities and dangers for our investigation. Her desperation made her less careful about concealing her actions, providing better evidence for our case. But it also increased the immediate threats to my health and safety, requiring additional precautions and medical monitoring. Dr. Wong recommended that I never eat or drink anything Linda had prepared without first testing it for contamination. He also provided me with medications that would counteract some of the substances Linda was using, allowing me to minimize symptoms while maintaining the appearance of ongoing health problems. This medical support was crucial for the final phase of our plan, which involved creating an opportunity for Linda to incriminate herself directly while providing undeniable evidence of her poisoning attempts. We needed recorded evidence of Linda admitting to drugging me, combined with physical evidence that would prove she was responsible for my symptoms. Rebecca and David developed a strategy that would create optimal conditions for Linda to confess her crimes while ensuring my safety and gathering irrefutable evidence. This plan required precise timing and coordination between multiple elements, but it offered the best opportunity to end Linda's threats permanently while ensuring she faced appropriate criminal consequences. The plan centered around one final family dinner where Linda would have the opportunity to poison me again, but this time we would be prepared with comprehensive surveillance and immediate medical response capabilities. I would need to consume enough of the contaminated food to trigger Linda's expected reaction, while avoiding dangerous levels of exposure to whatever substances she was using. Dr. Wong would be standing by with antidotes and medical support, while Rebecca's surveillance equipment would capture every moment of the dinner and Linda's response to my apparent symptoms. David would have law enforcement ready to respond immediately once we had recorded evidence of Linda's confession. The most challenging aspect of this plan was the psychological preparation required to voluntarily expose myself to poisoning while maintaining the appearance of normal behavior. I had to trust that our safety measures would protect me from serious harm, while creating believable symptoms that would prompt Linda to reveal her criminal activity. This preparation included practicing responses to different scenarios and developing strategies for guiding conversations toward topics that might prompt Linda to discuss her poisoning activities. Rebecca coached me on interrogation techniques that would encourage Linda to provide detailed admissions without realizing she was incriminating herself. We also prepared contingency plans for various ways Linda might react to the confrontation. If she became violent or attempted to flee, We needed immediate response capabilities that would ensure my safety while preserving evidence of her crimes. If she attempted to destroy evidence or contact accomplices, we needed surveillance that would document these additional criminal activities. The weeks leading up to our planned confrontation were intense and emotionally draining. I was simultaneously preparing to expose Linda's crimes while continuing to work with her on business matters and attend family gatherings where she was actively poisoning me. The cognitive dissonance of maintaining normal relationships with someone who was systematically trying to harm me required enormous psychological strength. But I also felt empowered by the knowledge that Linda's criminal enterprise was about to collapse completely. She had no idea that every conversation was being recorded, that every poisoning attempt was being documented, that every aspect of her fraud scheme had been discovered and would soon be used against her in criminal court. The night before our planned confrontation, I reviewed all the evidence we'd collected and felt confident that Linda would face serious criminal consequences for everything she'd done to Dad, to me, and to our family business. The months of careful investigation and evidence collection were about to pay off in ways that would ensure justice while protecting Dad's legacy. Sitting in the bathroom now, holding the plates I'm about to switch, I think about how Linda's arrogance and greed had led her to this moment. She thought she was clever enough to commit the perfect crime, that she could systematically destroy our family while enriching herself and her children. She had no idea that her intended victim had been 3 steps ahead of her from the moment I suspected her true intentions. Tonight, Linda was going to discover that underestimating me was the biggest mistake of her criminal career, and I was going to make sure that every word of her confession was recorded for the prosecutors who would be filing charges against her tomorrow morning. Taking a deep breath, I carefully switched the plates in my hands, ensuring that Linda's specially prepared lasagna was now on the plate I'd returned to my seat. The irony wasn't lost on me, that Linda's own cooking was about to become her downfall. I checked my hidden recording device one final time, making sure it was positioned correctly to capture everything that was about to unfold. When I returned to the dining room, Linda looked up with that same intense expression I'd noticed before, her eyes immediately going to the plate in my hands. She was waiting for me to continue eating, anticipating the moment when her carefully calculated dose of medication would begin affecting my system. The smile she gave me was warm and concerned, the perfect performance of a caring stepmother worried about her stepdaughter's health. "Feeling better, dear?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You looked a little pale when you left. I was worried that you might be coming down with something again. You've been having so many health issues lately." I nodded, forcing myself to appear slightly unsteady as I settled back into my chair. "Just a bit dizzy. I think I need to eat something. This lasagna smells wonderful." I picked up my fork and took a small bite from what was now Linda's original plate, the one she'd prepared without any contamination. The taste was completely normal, confirming that she'd reserved the poisoned portion specifically for me. Linda watched me eat with satisfaction, clearly believing her plan was proceeding perfectly. She began cutting into her own serving, the portion that contained whatever cocktail of medications she'd intended for me. Tyler and Madison sat at the table making small talk about their jobs and social plans, completely unaware of the drama unfolding between their mother and me. "Emma, I've been thinking about our conversation last week," Linda said, taking her first bite of the contaminated lasagna. "About your future plans and whether you might be happier focusing on your design business instead of the restaurants. I really believe you have so much potential that you're not exploring while you're tied down to family obligations." The condescension in her voice was barely concealed behind her concerned tone. She was already setting up her narrative for why my departure from the family business would be beneficial for everyone involved. What she didn't realize was that she'd just consumed a significant dose of the same substances she'd been using to undermine my health and credibility for months. I continued eating my uncontaminated food while responding to her comments about my career plans. "I appreciate your concern, Linda, but the restaurants have always been my passion. Dad and I built something really special together, and I can't imagine walking away from that legacy." "Oh, I understand the emotional attachment," Linda replied, taking another large bite of her dinner. "But sometimes we have to consider what's practical versus what's sentimental. Your father wouldn't want you to sacrifice your own opportunities out of loyalty to the past." Tyler nodded along with his mother's comments, adding his own observations about the restaurant industry's challenges and the benefits of diversifying career options. Madison chimed in with supportive remarks about my graphic design skills and how I could probably earn more money working with corporate clients than managing family businesses. As the conversation continued, I began noticing subtle changes in Linda's behavior. Her speech was becoming slightly slower, and she seemed to be having trouble maintaining her train of thought. The medications she'd intended for me were beginning to affect her system, creating the same symptoms I'd experienced during previous family dinners. "I've been doing some research," Linda continued, her words beginning to slur almost imperceptibly, "about restaurant valuations and market trends. The industry is becoming so competitive, and I worry that holding on to traditional approaches might not be sustainable for much longer." She paused to take a sip of water, and I noticed her hand trembling slightly as she lifted the glass. The tremor was subtle, but I'd experienced it myself often enough to recognize the early signs of whatever pharmaceutical combination she'd been using. Her pupils were beginning to dilate, and a faint flush was appearing on her cheeks. "Are you feeling all right, Linda?" I asked with genuine-sounding concern. "You look a little flushed. Maybe you should drink some more water." "I'm fine," she replied quickly, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. She was beginning to realize that something was wrong, but she hadn't yet connected her symptoms to the food she was eating. "Just tired, I think." It's been a long week dealing with estate paperwork and business decisions. Tyler and Madison began to look concerned as their mother's condition became more apparent. Linda was blinking frequently and seemed to be having difficulty focusing her eyes. Her movements were becoming less coordinated, and she was gripping the edge of the table as if to steady herself. "Mom, you really don't look well," Madison said, reaching across the table to touch Linda's forehead. "Maybe you should lie down for a while. You feel warm." "I said I'm fine," Linda snapped, her usual composure beginning to crack. The medications were affecting her emotional regulation, as well as her physical coordination. "I just need to finish dinner, and then we can discuss Emma's situation." But Linda was clearly not fine. She was experiencing exactly the same symptoms she'd been inflicting on me for months, and the irony was becoming more apparent with each passing minute. Her carefully controlled facade was dissolving, as the drugs impaired her ability to maintain the caring stepmother performance she'd perfected over the years. "You know what, Linda?" I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I think we should talk about my situation. I've been doing some research of my own lately, and I've discovered some very interesting information about family businesses and estate planning." Linda tried to focus on my words, but I could see the confusion and growing panic in her eyes. She was beginning to understand that something was seriously wrong, but her compromised mental state was making it difficult for her to process what was happening or respond appropriately. "What kind of research?" she asked, her voice becoming more strained with each word. The tremor in her hands was becoming more pronounced, and she was having visible difficulty coordinating her movements. "Well, for example, I learned some fascinating things about toxicology and how certain medications can be used to create symptoms that mimic natural illnesses," I said, watching Linda's face carefully for her reaction. "It's amazing how sophisticated these techniques can be when someone has the right knowledge and motivation." The color drained from Linda's face as my words registered. Even through her drug-induced haze, she was beginning to realize that I knew about her poisoning attempts. Her eyes darted around the room as if looking for escape routes, but her impaired coordination made any quick movement impossible. "I don't know what you're implying," Linda said, but her voice was weak and unconvincing. The medications were making it increasingly difficult for her to maintain her usual manipulative control over conversations. "If you're having health problems, maybe you should see a doctor instead of making wild accusations." "Oh, I've been seeing doctors," I replied, pulling out my phone and accessing the recording app that had been documenting our entire conversation. "Multiple doctors, actually, including toxicologists who specialize in cases exactly like mine." Tyler and Madison were looking back and forth between their mother and me with growing alarm. They could see that Linda was becoming seriously ill, but they were also beginning to pick up on the subtext of our conversation. The reality of what their mother had been doing was starting to dawn on them. "Mom, what is she talking about?" Tyler asked, his voice tight with concern. "What's going on here?" Linda tried to stand up from her chair, but her legs were too unsteady to support her weight. She gripped the table edge desperately, swaying as the full effects of the medication cocktail hit her system. Her breathing was becoming labored, and sweat was beading on her forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the room. "You switched the plates," Linda whispered, the realization finally penetrating her confused mental state. "You knew." "Yes, I knew," I confirmed, standing up from my own chair and maintaining a safe distance from Linda as her condition deteriorated. "I've known for weeks about what you've been doing to me. The question is, are you going to tell Tyler and Madison the truth about how you've been poisoning me, or should I explain it to them myself?" "Poisoning?" Madison gasped, her face going pale. "Mom, what is she talking about? You haven't been poisoning anyone." Linda was struggling to remain conscious as the medications overwhelmed her system. The careful dosing she'd perfected for gradually undermining my health was having dramatic effects when consumed all at once by someone who hadn't built up any tolerance to the substances. "She's lying," Linda managed to say, but her words were badly slurred and unconvincing. "Emma's been having mental health problems since her father died. She's imagining things, making up stories." "Really?" I said, pulling up the toxicology reports on my phone. "Because I have medical evidence showing exactly what you've been putting in my food." Dr. Wong found traces of sedatives, anti-anxiety medications, and muscle relaxants in my system. All substances that would explain the symptoms I've been experiencing after our family dinners. Tyler was staring at his mother with horror and disbelief. "Mom, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you haven't been drugging Emma." Linda tried to respond, but the combination of medications was making speech increasingly difficult. She was slumping in her chair, unable to maintain her posture or focus her attention. The woman who had spent months carefully orchestrating my destruction was now completely helpless, experiencing firsthand the effects of her own criminal actions. "The ironic thing," I continued, "is that you taught me exactly what to look for. Every symptom you caused me to experience, you're now feeling yourself. The dizziness, the nausea, the confusion, the inability to think clearly. This is what you've been doing to me for months, Linda." "I was protecting the family," Linda mumbled, her voice barely audible. "You were going to ruin everything your father built. You don't understand business. You're too emotional, too attached to the past." Madison was crying now, staring at her mother with a mixture of shock and disgust. "Mom, how could you do something like this? How could you poison someone?" "She was in the way," Linda said, her inhibitions completely destroyed by the pharmaceutical cocktail she'd consumed. "The restaurants, the estate, everything should have gone to us. We deserved it after everything I sacrificed for that man." The confession was coming out in fragmented sentences as Linda's ability to control her words disappeared entirely. Years of careful manipulation and calculated deception were being undone by her own criminal tools turned against her. "You didn't sacrifice anything," I said firmly. "You targeted my father because he was wealthy and vulnerable. You manipulated him into changing his estate plans. You tried to drive me away from the business we built together, and when that didn't work, you started poisoning me to undermine my credibility." "He was lonely," Linda continued, apparently unable to stop herself from talking. "Stupid and lonely and grateful for any attention. I made him think he loved me, made him think his precious daughter was the problem." Tyler was backing away from the table, his face white with shock and revulsion. "Mom, stop talking. Just stop." "And the will you showed me after Dad's death?" I prompted, knowing that Linda's compromised state made this the perfect opportunity to get a complete confession. "The one that left everything to you and your children?" "Forged," Linda admitted, her head lolling as she struggled to remain conscious. "The old fool never changed his real will. Everything was supposed to go to you, but I wasn't going to let that happen. Not after everything I did for him." "What about Dad's concerns about missing money from the restaurant accounts?" I asked, continuing to record as Linda incriminated herself further. "I took what I deserved," Linda slurred. "What we all deserved. The restaurants were making good money, and I needed to secure our future before you could interfere." Madison was sobbing openly now, horrified by her mother's admissions. "Mom, please stop. You're confessing to crimes." "The girl was always suspicious," Linda continued, apparently unable to process her daughter's warnings. "Too smart for her own good, just like her father said. Had to make her sick, make her look unstable. Couldn't let her keep interfering with my plans." "So you decided to poison me," I said, ensuring that Linda's confession was being captured clearly on my recording device. "Small doses," Linda mumbled. "Just enough to make you confused, unreliable, make people think you were having a breakdown after your father's death. Then Tyler and Madison could take over the business properly." Tyler was shaking his head in disbelief. "We never asked you to do this, Mom. We never wanted you to hurt anyone." "You wanted the money," Linda accused, her emotional control completely gone. "You both wanted the inheritance, the restaurants, the house. Don't pretend you didn't know what I was doing." "We didn't know," Madison cried. "We thought Dad had actually left those things to us in his will. We didn't know you were forging documents and poisoning people." Linda was becoming increasingly incoherent as the medications continued to affect her system. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that indicated serious medical distress. Despite everything she'd done to me, I couldn't let her suffer a potentially fatal overdose. I called 911, explaining that we had a medical emergency and needed paramedics immediately. I also contacted David Chen and told him that we had successfully recorded Linda's confession and needed law enforcement to respond to the scene. While we waited for emergency responders, Linda continued to ramble about her grievances against Dad and me. She complained about how ungrateful we'd been for her contributions to the family, how we'd never appreciated the sacrifices she'd made to be part of our lives. Her version of events was completely distorted, painting herself as the victim of our selfishness and ingratitude. "I gave him the best years of my life," Linda mumbled. "Pretended to love him, pretended to care about his stupid restaurants and his precious Mexican traditions. I deserved everything he had." "You deserve nothing," I said firmly. "You're a predator who targeted a grieving widower and tried to steal everything he'd built for his daughter." Tyler and Madison sat in stunned silence, clearly struggling to process their mother's revelations. They'd benefited from Linda's criminal activities without understanding the extent of her deception, and now they were facing the reality that their expected inheritance was built on fraud and attempted murder. The paramedics arrived first, immediately beginning treatment for Linda's overdose symptoms. They asked what she'd consumed, and I provided them with the information Drive Wong had given me about the medications Linda had been using. The medical team worked quickly to stabilize her condition and prepare her for transport to the hospital. Detective Maria Santos arrived shortly after the paramedics, along with uniformed officers who secured the scene and began collecting evidence. I provided Detective Santos with copies of all our recorded conversations, the toxicology reports from Dr. Wong, and the documentation Rebecca Torres had compiled during her investigation. Detective Santos listened to portions of Linda's recorded confession with amazement and disgust. She'd seen many cases of family fraud and elder abuse, but the sophistication of Linda's criminal enterprise was unusual. The systematic poisoning, forged documents, and long-term manipulation represented a complex conspiracy that would result in serious federal charges. "We'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to provide a formal statement," Detective Santos explained. "But this recording and the medical evidence you've provided give us more than enough to file charges for attempted poisoning, fraud, and conspiracy." Tyler and Madison were questioned separately about their knowledge of their mother's activities. While they'd clearly benefited from Linda's crimes, it appeared that they hadn't been aware of the poisoning or the extent of the document forgery. Their cooperation with the investigation would likely result in reduced charges, but they would still face legal consequences for their participation in the fraud scheme. As Linda was loaded into the ambulance, still semi-conscious and mumbling incoherently, I felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction. The woman who had terrorized me for months was finally facing consequences for her actions. Her own criminal tools had been turned against her, and her carefully constructed web of lies had collapsed completely. David Chen arrived at the house just as the ambulance was pulling away. He'd been monitoring the situation remotely and was prepared to begin immediate legal action to recover Dad's stolen assets and restore my rightful position as his heir. The evidence we'd collected provided grounds for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery. "This is even better than we hoped," David said, reviewing the recordings on my phone. "Linda's confession covers every aspect of her criminal activity. We can use this to reverse all the unauthorized transactions, invalidate the forged will, and restore your father's legitimate estate planning." The investigation that followed would reveal the full extent of Linda's criminal enterprise. Her pattern of targeting wealthy older men went back over a decade and included multiple victims across several states. The FBI became involved due to the interstate nature of her crimes, and she eventually faced federal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Tyler and Madison ultimately cooperated with authorities and testified against their mother in exchange for reduced sentences. They were ordered to pay restitution for their participation in the financial fraud, but avoided prison time due to their cooperation and apparent lack of knowledge about the poisoning attempts. The restaurants were restored to my control, and I began the process of undoing the damage Linda and her children had inflicted on our operations. Many of the longtime employees welcomed the return to our traditional practices and cultural identity. The customers who had been disappointed by recent changes expressed enthusiasm about our return to authentic family recipes and Mexican-American heritage. Standing in the empty dining room after everyone had left, I thought about how Dad would have felt about the evening's events. He would have been heartbroken to learn about Linda's deception and the extent of her manipulation, but I believe he would have been proud of how I'd protected his legacy and brought justice to someone who had tried to destroy everything we'd built together. Linda's attempt to poison me had ultimately led to her own downfall, providing the evidence needed to expose her entire criminal operation. Her arrogance and cruelty had blinded her to the possibility that her intended victim might be intelligent and resourceful enough to turn her own weapons against her. Tomorrow would begin the long process of legal proceedings and business recovery, but tonight I could finally rest knowing that Linda's threats were over. The restaurants would continue honoring Dad's legacy, and the woman who had tried to destroy our family was facing the consequences of her crimes. The ambulance doors slammed shut with Linda inside, still mumbling incoherent confessions as the paramedics worked to stabilize her condition. Detective Santos turned to me as the vehicle pulled away from our family home, red and blue lights cutting through the darkness of what had become the most important evening of my life. The woman who had terrorized me for months was finally facing the consequences of her own criminal actions, and I felt a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and grim satisfaction watching her being taken away. "We'll need you at the station first thing tomorrow morning for a complete statement," Detective Santos said, tucking her notebook into her jacket pocket. "But I want you to know that what you've accomplished here tonight is extraordinary. Most poisoning victims never get this kind of evidence or justice." Tyler and Madison sat on the front porch steps, both crying and trying to process the reality of what their mother had been doing for months. They kept asking each other whether they should have known, whether there had been signs they'd missed or ignored. The weight of their mother's crimes was settling on them, and they were beginning to understand that their expected inheritance had been built on systematic fraud and attempted murder. David Chen arrived as the police were finishing their initial evidence collection. He'd been monitoring the situation from his office, ready to begin immediate legal action once we had Linda's recorded confession. The satisfaction on his face was evident as he reviewed the audio files on my phone, listening to Linda incriminate herself completely, while under the influence of her own poisoning methods. "This is even better than we hoped for," David said, scrolling through the recordings. "She's confessed to everything. The poisoning, the forged will, the embezzlement, the manipulation of your father. We have grounds for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery of every asset she's touched." The next few hours passed in a blur of police interviews, evidence documentation, and legal strategy discussions. Rebecca Torres arrived to coordinate with law enforcement and ensure that all the surveillance equipment and recorded conversations were properly transferred to Detective Santos. The investigation we'd been conducting for weeks was now an official criminal case with federal implications. Dr. Wong arrived at the house around midnight to examine me and ensure that I hadn't suffered any ill effects from the small amount of contaminated food I'd consumed before switching the plates. He pronounced me completely healthy and expressed amazement at how perfectly our plan had worked. Linda's own criminal tools had provided the evidence needed to destroy her entire scheme. "I've never seen a case where the perpetrator was caught so completely by their own methods," Dr. Wong said as he packed up his medical equipment. "The irony is almost poetic. She spent months carefully calculating doses to undermine your health and credibility, and tonight she consumed enough of those same substances to confess to everything." As dawn broke over Portland, I found myself sitting in David's office reviewing the evidence we'd collected and planning our legal strategy. The recordings from dinner provided confession evidence that would support criminal charges, but we also needed to address the civil matters of recovering stolen assets and restoring my rightful position as Dad's heir. The forged will Linda had presented after Dad's death was now completely discredited by her own admissions. David pulled out the legitimate estate planning documents Dad had created over the years, showing clearly that his intention had always been to leave the restaurants and his other assets to me. Linda's claim that Dad had changed his mind about succession planning was exposed as complete fabrication. We'll file motions this morning to have Linda's fraudulent will invalidated and your father's legitimate documents recognized by the probate court, David explained. With her confession, this should be straightforward. The challenge will be recovering all the money she's stolen and undoing the damage she's done to the business operations. Rebecca's financial investigation had revealed the extent of Linda's embezzlement from the restaurant accounts. Over the past year, she'd systematically transferred money to accounts controlled by shell companies she'd established. She'd also sold equipment and inventory at below-market prices to buyers who appeared to be her criminal associates, pocketing the difference between actual value and reported sales prices. The total amount of stolen assets exceeded $400,000, money that Linda had been planning to use for her relocation to Florida after selling the restaurants. Her scheme had been designed to liquidate Dad's entire legacy while enriching herself and her children at the expense of everything he'd worked to build. Linda survived her overdose, though she spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from the pharmaceutical cocktail she'd intended for me. During her hospitalization, she was under constant police guard and surveillance, prevented from contacting potential accomplices or attempting to destroy additional evidence. Her room became a virtual prison as investigators worked to document the full scope of her criminal enterprise. Tyler and Madison were questioned extensively about their knowledge of their mother's activities. While they'd clearly benefited from Linda's fraud scheme, it became apparent that they hadn't been aware of the poisoning attempts or the extent of the document forgery. Their cooperation with investigators would ultimately save them from the most serious charges, though they would still face significant legal consequences. The federal investigation expanded rapidly as authorities discovered Linda's pattern of targeting wealthy older men across multiple states. The FBI took over the case when evidence emerged of similar schemes in California, Arizona, and Nevada. Linda had been operating her criminal enterprise for over a decade, leaving a trail of destroyed families and stolen inheritances that totaled millions of dollars. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh was assigned to lead the federal investigation into Linda's crimes. She'd specialized in inheritance fraud and elder abuse cases for over 15 years, and immediately recognized the sophisticated nature of Linda's operations. Unlike many criminals who targeted elderly victims opportunistically, Linda had developed systematic methods for identifying, grooming, and exploiting vulnerable men with substantial assets. This is one of the most organized inheritance fraud schemes I've encountered, Agent Walsh explained during our first meeting at the FBI field office. Your stepmother wasn't just an opportunistic predator. She was running a professional criminal operation with multiple victims, accomplices, and sophisticated methods for avoiding detection. The investigation revealed that Linda had used various names and identities during her criminal career, making it difficult for authorities to connect her activities across different jurisdictions. She'd established fake businesses and shell companies to hide stolen assets, and she'd developed relationships with corrupt real estate agents and lawyers who helped her manipulate estate transactions. Linda's first known victim had been a widowed rancher in California whose children discovered financial irregularities only after he'd died from what appeared to be a heart attack. By the time they realized their father's estate had been systematically looted, Linda had disappeared with over $800,000 and had moved to Arizona to begin targeting her next victim. Her second victim was a retired engineer whose adult daughter had tried to warn him about Linda's manipulative behavior. Linda had responded by convincing the man that his daughter was mentally unstable and trying to steal his money. She'd isolated him from his family and friends, much as she'd done with Dad, before inheriting his entire estate when he died in what was ruled an accidental fall at their home. The pattern was consistent across all of Linda's known victims. She would target recently widowed men with substantial assets and adult children who might interfere with her plans. She would present herself as a caring companion who could help them navigate their grief and loneliness. Once she'd established trust and romantic involvement, she would begin systematically isolating them from family and friends, while positioning herself as their primary caregiver and advocate. Linda's manipulation techniques were sophisticated and psychologically devastating. She would use her victims' grief and vulnerability against them, convincing them that their adult children were motivated by greed, rather than genuine concern. She would create conflicts between her victims and their families, then position herself as the only person who truly understood and supported them. The poisoning component of Linda's scheme appeared to be a relatively recent addition to her criminal methods. Previous victims hadn't shown evidence of systematic drugging, suggesting that Linda had developed this technique specifically for situations where her usual manipulation wasn't sufficient to eliminate family interference. I had been her first poisoning victim, the test case for methods she planned to use against future targets. Dr. Wong's analysis of the substances Linda had been using revealed the sophistication of her pharmaceutical knowledge. She hadn't simply been grinding up random pills and mixing them into food. She'd been using specific combinations of medications that would create particular symptoms while avoiding obvious signs of poisoning or overdose. The precision of her dosing suggests either medical training or extensive research into pharmacological effects, Dr. Wong explained. She knew exactly which substances would cause cognitive impairment, physical weakness, and emotional instability, without creating symptoms that would prompt immediate medical investigation. The investigation into Linda's background revealed that she'd worked briefly as a pharmaceutical sales representative early in her career, giving her access to detailed information about medication effects and interactions. She'd also completed online courses in geriatric care and elder psychology, apparently as preparation for her criminal activities rather than legitimate career development. This professional preparation distinguished Linda from typical inheritance fraud perpetrators and explained why her schemes had been so successful for so many years. She'd approached criminal activity with the same systematic planning that legitimate businesses use for market research and strategic development. The trial preparation process took several months as federal prosecutors built their case against Linda and coordinated with law enforcement agencies in multiple states. The charges against her eventually included mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and attempted murder, with some counts carrying potential life sentences. Tyler was charged with conspiracy and money laundering for his role in managing fraudulent financial transactions, though his cooperation with investigators and apparent lack of knowledge about the poisoning resulted in a plea agreement for reduced charges. Madison faced similar charges related to her involvement in digital manipulation and document forgery, but her cooperation also led to a reduced sentence. Linda herself showed no remorse or willingness to cooperate with investigators. Even when presented with overwhelming evidence of her crimes, she maintained that she'd been wrongfully accused by ungrateful families who didn't appreciate her sacrifices for their loved ones. Her complete lack of empathy or acknowledgement of harm done to her victims disturbed even experienced law enforcement officers. The trial began 8 months after Linda's arrest, with proceedings that attracted national media attention due to the unusual nature of her crimes and the sophisticated methods she'd used to exploit elderly victims. Reporters described her as a black widow who had systematically destroyed families while enriching herself through fraud and manipulation. My testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, providing detailed accounts of Linda's manipulation techniques, the effects of her poisoning campaign, and the evidence we'd gathered to expose her crimes. Sitting in the witness stand, describing months of systematic abuse while Linda stared at me with cold hatred, was one of the most difficult experiences of my life, but it was also empowering to finally tell the complete truth about what Linda had done to our family. For years, she'd controlled narratives and manipulated perceptions, making people doubt their own observations and instincts. Now, in a court of law with evidence and witnesses, the truth was finally being heard and acknowledged. The other victims' family members also testified, describing similar patterns of manipulation and exploitation that Linda had used across multiple relationships. Their testimony established the systematic nature of her criminal enterprise and demonstrated that our family's experience wasn't an isolated incident but part of a decade-long pattern of predatory behavior. Dr. Wong's testimony about the poisoning was particularly powerful, explaining to the jury how Linda had used sophisticated pharmaceutical knowledge to systematically undermine my health and cognitive function. His analysis of the substances found in my system provided scientific evidence of attempted murder that complemented the recorded confessions we'd obtained. The defense team's strategy focused on portraying Linda as a woman who had genuinely cared for her elderly husbands and had been wrongfully accused by bitter family members who resented her relationships with their loved ones. They attempted to characterize the poisoning as accidental medication errors rather than deliberate criminal activity. This defense strategy collapsed completely when prosecutors played the recordings of Linda's dinner confessions. Hearing her own voice admitting to poisoning me, forging Dad's will, and stealing money from the restaurant accounts made it impossible for even her own lawyers to maintain claims of innocence or accidental wrongdoing. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Linda showed no emotion as the verdict was read, staring straight ahead with the same cold expression she'd maintained throughout the trial. Her lack of remorse or acknowledgement of her victim's suffering seemed to disturb the jurors, several of whom later described her demeanor as chilling and inhuman. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for victims' family members to address Linda directly and describe the impact of her crimes on their lives. I spoke about losing precious time with Dad during his final years, about the health problems she'd caused through systematic poisoning, and about the damage she'd inflicted on our family business and cultural heritage. Linda Rodriguez targeted my father because he was vulnerable in his grief, but she underestimated the strength of the family bonds and cultural values he'd instilled in me, I said, looking directly at her as she sat at the defendant's table. Her attempt to destroy our legacy ultimately revealed the resilience and determination that my father had spent his life building in me and our community. Other family members shared similar statements, describing how Linda's crimes had affected not just financial security but also their ability to trust future relationships and their confidence in their own perceptions and judgments. The psychological damage she'd inflicted through manipulation and gaslighting had created lasting trauma that extended far beyond the financial losses. The federal judge who presided over the case, the Honorable Patricia Chen, described Linda's crimes as particularly heinous due to their calculated nature and the vulnerability of her victims. She noted that Linda had specifically targeted men who were grieving the loss of their spouses, exploiting their emotional vulnerability for financial gain, while destroying family relationships that had sustained them through decades of life. The defendant's crimes represent a profound betrayal of trust and human decency, Judge Chen said during the sentencing hearing. She systematically exploited the grief and loneliness of vulnerable men while destroying the family relationships that should have provided comfort and support during their final years. Linda was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, essentially a life sentence given her age and health status. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to all identified victims, though much of the stolen money had been spent or hidden in accounts that investigators were still working to locate. Tyler received 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, along with orders to pay restitution for his participation in the financial fraud. Madison was sentenced to 2 years of probation and 800 hours of community service, with additional requirements for financial counseling and regular reporting to probation officers. The civil litigation to recover stolen assets and restore Dad's legitimate estate planning took additional months to resolve, but ultimately we recovered nearly everything Linda had taken from our family and business. David's thorough documentation of her criminal activities provided clear evidence for civil court proceedings, and Linda's criminal conviction eliminated any remaining doubt about the legitimacy of our claims. The restaurants were officially restored to my ownership, along with the family home and all of Dad's other assets that Linda had attempted to claim through her forged will. We also recovered the money she'd stolen from business accounts, though some funds remained frozen in accounts connected to her criminal associates who were facing their own legal proceedings. Restoring the restaurants to proper operation required extensive work to undo the damage Linda and her children had inflicted during their brief control of our business. They'd made numerous changes that had compromised food quality, reduced employee morale, and alienated longtime customers who had supported our family for decades. The first priority was returning to the authentic recipes and preparation methods that had built our reputation in Portland's Mexican-American community. Tyler's cost-cutting modifications had eliminated many of the time-intensive techniques that gave our dishes their distinctive flavors, replacing traditional ingredients with cheaper alternatives that saved money but destroyed the character of our family's cuisine. Working with our head chef Maria, who had been with our family for over 15 years, we systematically restored each menu item to its original preparation method. This process revealed how much institutional knowledge Tyler's changes had threatened to destroy, as many of our traditional techniques existed only in the memories of experienced kitchen staff rather than written documentation. Maria had been particularly distressed by Tyler's modifications to our signature enchilada recipe, the dish that had launched our family's restaurant business and connected us to our grandmother's culinary heritage. She'd tried to maintain traditional preparation methods despite Tyler's pressure to simplify the process, and she expressed genuine relief when we restored the original recipe, with all its complex layering of flavors and time-intensive preparation requirements. "It broke my heart to watch him change your grandmother's recipe," Maria told me as we worked together to retrain kitchen staff in proper enchilada preparation. "That dish tells the story of your family's journey from Mexico to Portland. When you change the recipe, you lose the history and the love that made it special." Rebuilding our team required honest conversations with employees about what had happened during Linda's control of the business and why the changes they'd been asked to implement had compromised our standards and values. Many staff members had been confused and demoralized by policies that seemed to contradict everything they'd learned about our family's approach to food service and customer relationships. Several longtime employees shared that they'd considered leaving during Tyler's tenure as assistant manager because they were uncomfortable with the cost-cutting measures and quality reductions he'd implemented. They'd stayed out of loyalty to Dad's memory and hoped that the situation would improve, but they'd watched customer satisfaction decline and worried about the future of jobs they'd held for years. "We knew something was wrong," explained Carlos, our senior server who had worked for us for 12 years. "The food didn't taste right, customers were complaining, and everything felt different. But Tyler kept saying these changes were necessary for business success, so we tried to adapt, even though it didn't feel right." These conversations revealed how Linda's manipulation had extended beyond our family relationships to affect every aspect of our business operations. She'd created doubt and confusion among employees who had previously been confident in their roles and proud of their contributions to our family's success. Restoring employee confidence required demonstrating through consistent actions that we were returning to the values and standards that had always defined our restaurants. This meant not just changing recipes and policies, but also involving staff members in decision-making processes and acknowledging their expertise and institutional knowledge. I promoted several longtime employees to supervisory positions, recognizing their dedication during difficult circumstances and ensuring that future management decisions would reflect the practical experience and cultural understanding that Linda had tried to eliminate from our operations. Reconnecting with our customer base required acknowledging the problems that had occurred during Linda's influence, while demonstrating our commitment to the authentic Mexican-American cuisine and cultural atmosphere that had originally attracted their loyalty. We organized community events featuring traditional mariachi music, cultural celebrations, and educational programs about Mexican-American culinary traditions. The response from longtime customers was overwhelmingly positive. People who had stopped visiting our restaurants during Linda's control began returning as word spread about our restoration of traditional recipes and cultural programming. Social media reviews improved dramatically as diners rediscovered the authentic flavors and warm atmosphere they remembered from previous years. "I'm so glad you brought back the real enchiladas," wrote one customer in an online review. "My family has been coming here for 20 years, and we were heartbroken when the food changed. Now it tastes like home again, the way your father intended." These customer responses reinforced our understanding that Linda's attempts to modernize and mainstream our restaurants had fundamentally misunderstood what made them successful. Our strength had never been generic appeal or cost efficiency, but rather our authentic representation of Mexican-American culture and our commitment to preserving traditional culinary techniques. The financial recovery process revealed the full extent of Linda's embezzlement and fraud, with losses totaling over $600,000 when all unauthorized transactions and undervalued asset sales were calculated. She'd been systematically draining money from business accounts while preparing to abandon the restaurants entirely, viewing them as assets to be liquidated rather than ongoing businesses with value to employees and community. Rebecca's investigation had uncovered evidence that Linda was planning to sell all 3 restaurant locations to a development company for significantly below market value, with arrangements for private compensation that would have enriched her while destroying the businesses Dad had spent decades building. The buyer turned out to be connected to her criminal network, part of a sophisticated scheme for converting stolen assets into untraceable cash. Recovering these stolen funds required coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies and financial institutions, as Linda had moved money through various accounts and shell companies to hide the trail of her embezzlement. Some funds were recovered directly from accounts she controlled, while others were recovered through asset forfeiture proceedings against her criminal associates. The investigation also revealed that Linda had been planning to claim life insurance payouts on Dad's death, policies that she'd convinced him to modify during their marriage to name her as primary beneficiary. These policies would have provided her with additional hundreds of thousands of dollars if her other criminal activities hadn't been exposed. Fortunately, Dad's original estate planning documents included specific instructions about life insurance beneficiaries that contradicted the changes Linda had attempted to make. David was able to demonstrate that these modifications had been made without proper legal procedures and were therefore invalid, ensuring that the insurance proceeds went to support our family's restaurant operations rather than Linda's criminal enterprise. The personal healing process proved more complex and time-intensive than the business recovery, though both were essential for moving beyond the trauma Linda had inflicted on our family and our operations. The months of systematic poisoning had affected not only my physical health but also my confidence, my relationships, and my fundamental sense of security and trust. Dr. Martinez referred me to Dr. Lisa Park, a psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery and family abuse cases. Through counseling sessions that continued for over a year, I was able to process the complex emotions surrounding Linda's betrayal and the loss of my relationship with Dad during his final years, when her manipulation was most intense. Poisoning victims often experience a particular type of trauma that combines physical violation with psychological manipulation, Dr. Park explained during our early sessions. Linda wasn't just harming your body with medications, she was systematically undermining your reality and your ability to trust your own perceptions. The therapy helped me understand that Linda's gaslighting had been sophisticated and deliberate, designed to make me question my own memories and observations, while positioning her as a more reliable source of information about Dad's wishes and our family dynamics. She'd used my love for Dad against me, suggesting that my concerns about her behavior were signs of my inability to accept his happiness in his new marriage. One of the most difficult aspects of recovery was accepting that Dad had been vulnerable to Linda's manipulation, despite his intelligence and business acumen. I'd always seen him as strong and decisive, someone who couldn't be easily deceived or controlled by others. Understanding that grief and loneliness had made him susceptible to Linda's calculated approach required me to forgive both him and myself for not recognizing the full extent of her deception earlier. Intelligent, successful people are often more vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation because they assume their judgment and experience protect them from deception, Dr. Park explained. Linda specifically targeted men like your father because their confidence in their own abilities made them less likely to recognize subtle manipulation techniques. The therapy also addressed the complex grief I was experiencing over losing Dad while he was still alive, watching Linda systematically isolate him from our shared history and values, while convincing him that this isolation was beneficial for everyone involved. The man who had raised me to be independent and confident had spent his final years deferring to someone who had no understanding of our family's heritage or shared experiences. Processing this grief required acknowledging both the love Dad had always shown me and the pain of watching him doubt our relationship under Linda's influence. Dr. Park helped me understand that Linda's manipulation had been designed to create exactly this kind of confusion and self-doubt, using my own love for Dad to make me question whether I was being selfish or unreasonable in my concerns about her behavior. The physical recovery from months of low-level poisoning revealed how significantly Linda's criminal activities had affected my daily functioning and professional capabilities. As the medications cleared from my system and my brain chemistry returned to normal, I experienced energy and mental clarity that I hadn't felt since before Linda entered our lives. The chronic fatigue, digestive problems, and cognitive fog that I'd attributed to stress and grief had actually been symptoms of deliberate pharmaceutical manipulation designed to undermine my effectiveness as Dad's business partner and advocate. Linda had been systematically destroying my ability to think clearly during important business discussions or respond effectively to her manipulative arguments. Understanding the full scope of what Linda had done to compromise my capabilities made her crimes even more disturbing and personal. She hadn't simply been trying to make me sick for its own sake. She'd been strategically targeting the cognitive functions and emotional stability that I needed to protect Dad's interests and our family business. The medications Linda was using specifically affect executive function, memory consolidation, and emotional regulation, Dr. Wong explained during one of my follow-up medical appointments. She was essentially giving you controlled doses of substances that would make you appear unstable and unreliable, while making it harder for you to recognize and respond to her manipulation. This medical analysis helped explain why I'd often felt confused and uncertain during family conversations with Linda, even when discussing topics where I had extensive knowledge and experience. The substances she was giving me had been designed to create exactly this kind of cognitive impairment while maintaining the appearance of normal function to outside observers. The recovery process also involved rebuilding relationships with friends and colleagues who had witnessed my declining health and performance during Linda's poisoning campaign. Some people had expressed concern about my apparent symptoms, while others had begun to question my reliability and professional capabilities as Linda had intended. Explaining the situation to business associates and personal friends required careful consideration of how much detail to share and how to rebuild trust, without appearing to make excuses for past problems. Many people were shocked to learn about Linda's criminal activities and expressed regret that they hadn't recognized the signs of systematic abuse. "I knew something was wrong, but I never would have imagined anything like this," said Jennifer, a longtime friend who had noticed my declining energy and frequent illnesses during family gatherings. "Linda seemed so caring and concerned about your health. I thought you were just having trouble coping with your father's death." These conversations revealed how effectively Linda had manipulated perceptions and controlled narratives even beyond our immediate family. Her performance as a concerned stepmother worried about my well-being had been convincing enough to fool people who had known me for years. The community response to our story was overwhelming and largely supportive, creating connections and support networks that helped with both personal healing and business recovery. Local media coverage of Linda's crimes and our legal victory prompted an outpouring of encouragement from customers, business associates, and community members who had known our family for decades. Many people shared their own experiences with family manipulation and inheritance fraud, creating opportunities for mutual support and education about recognizing and responding to sophisticated exploitation schemes. These conversations revealed that Linda's type of predatory behavior was more common than most people realized, though rarely prosecuted as successfully as our case had been. Portland's Mexican-American community rallied around our restaurants and our efforts to preserve the cultural traditions that Linda had tried to eliminate from our business operations. Community leaders organized events at our locations, cultural organizations featured our story in their newsletters, and local families made special efforts to support our recovery by dining with us regularly. "Your family's restaurants have always been gathering places for our community," said Father Miguel Santos, pastor of the local Catholic Church where Dad had been a longtime member. "Linda's attempt to destroy that cultural connection was an attack on all of us, and your victory in protecting your father's legacy is a victory for everyone who values our heritage." This community support provided both practical benefits for our business recovery and emotional validation for the importance of the cultural preservation work we'd been doing for decades. It reinforced our understanding that our restaurants served purposes beyond simple food service, functioning as cultural centers that maintained connections to Mexican-American traditions for families across Portland. Several business organizations and law enforcement agencies invited me to speak about recognizing and responding to inheritance, fraud, and elder abuse, using our experience to educate other families about warning signs and protective strategies. These speaking engagements became opportunities to honor Dad's memory while helping prevent future victims from experiencing the kind of systematic exploitation Linda had inflicted on our family. The presentations I developed focused on practical advice for families dealing with new relationships in their elderly parents' lives, emphasizing the importance of maintaining oversight of financial matters and staying alert to manipulation techniques that predators use to isolate their victims from family support systems. The most important lesson from our experience is that love and concern must be demonstrated through consistent actions over time, not just charming words during a crisis, I would tell audiences. Linda was able to manipulate my father because she understood exactly what a grieving widower wanted to hear, but her actions over time revealed her true motivations to anyone who was paying attention. These educational efforts attracted attention from researchers studying family fraud and elder abuse prevention. University professors and policy analysts requested interviews and case study materials that could be used to improve training for social workers, healthcare providers, and law enforcement officers who encounter similar situations. Contributing to these research efforts felt like a meaningful way to ensure that Linda's crimes would have positive consequences by helping develop better protection systems for vulnerable elderly individuals. The sophistication of her manipulation techniques provided valuable insights into how predators operate and what warning signs families and professionals should watch for. The legal case also led to policy changes in banking regulations and estate administration procedures designed to prevent similar fraud schemes in the future. Financial institutions implemented additional verification requirements for large estate-related transactions, and probate courts adopted enhanced scrutiny procedures for will modifications made shortly before death. While these policy changes couldn't undo the damage Linda had inflicted on our family and her other victims, they offered hope that future targets might receive protection and intervention more quickly. The systemic changes felt like an important part of Dad's legacy, extending the impact of his life and our struggle for justice beyond our immediate situation. 1 year after Linda's sentencing, I organized a memorial celebration for Dad at our original restaurant location, bringing together the community that had supported our family through decades of success and recent trauma. The event honored his contributions to Portland's Mexican-American community, while celebrating our successful preservation of his legacy, despite Linda's attempts to destroy it. The memorial featured Dad's favorite mariachi music, traditional dancing, and a feast prepared using all the family recipes Linda had tried to eliminate from our menus. We served his beloved enchiladas made exactly according to our grandmother's original technique, tamales prepared the way his mother had taught him as a child, and mole sauce that required 3 days of preparation using ingredients imported from Guadalajara. Tonight we celebrate not just Michael Rodriguez's life but the triumph of love over greed, family over manipulation, and truth over deception, I said, addressing the crowd of employees, customers, and community members who had gathered to honor Dad's memory. Linda thought she could steal our heritage and destroy our legacy, but she underestimated the strength of the bonds my father built with this community. During the memorial event, I officially announced plans for our 4th restaurant location, which would serve as both a dining establishment and a cultural center dedicated to preserving and sharing Mexican-American traditions. The Emma and Michael Rodriguez Cultural Center would offer cooking classes, language lessons, cultural workshops, and community events that would extend our family's mission beyond commercial food service. The Cultural Center project had been inspired by conversations Dad and I had shared about expanding our impact in Portland's Mexican-American community. He'd always envisioned our restaurants as more than businesses, seeing them as platforms for cultural education and community building that could help preserve traditions for future generations. Your father dreamed of creating a place where families could learn about their heritage and share their stories, Maria said during the memorial celebration. This cultural center will make that dream real and ensure that his vision continues growing long after we're all gone. Funding for the cultural center came partly from the financial recovery from Linda's crimes, creating something positive and enduring from the money she'd stolen from our family and business. The irony that her criminal proceeds would support cultural preservation and community education felt like perfect justice for the damage she'd tried to inflict on our heritage. The Cultural Center would also house a scholarship program for local students pursuing careers in culinary arts, business management, cultural preservation, and community development. Recipients would have opportunities to intern at our restaurants and participate in cultural programming while receiving financial support for their education. These scholarships represent the kind of investment in young people that my father always believed in, I explained to the memorial audience. Linda tried to steal from the next generation by destroying our family business, but now her stolen money will help young people build better futures for themselves and their communities. The memorial celebration marked a turning point in our recovery process, transforming our story from one of victimization and trauma into one of resilience and community triumph. Standing before the crowd of people who had supported our family through tragedy and recovery, I felt connected to something larger than our individual experience. Linda's attempt to destroy our family had ultimately revealed the strength of community bonds and cultural values that she'd never understood or appreciated. Her crimes had been motivated by greed and selfishness, but our response had been guided by love, justice, and commitment to preserving something meaningful for future generations. The investigation and prosecution of Linda's crimes continued to have ripple effects throughout law enforcement and legal communities across multiple states. Her case became a model for how families can successfully document and prosecute sophisticated inheritance fraud, and her techniques were studied by investigators working on similar cases. Agent Walsh used our case as a training example for FBI courses on elder abuse and family fraud, emphasizing the importance of thorough documentation and the value of recording technology in gathering evidence against manipulative perpetrators. The audio recordings of Linda's confessions became textbook examples of how criminals' own words can provide the most powerful evidence against them. The Rodriguez case demonstrates that even the most sophisticated predators can be caught when families are prepared to document criminal behavior systematically, Agent Walsh explained during law enforcement training sessions. Linda's schemes had worked for over a decade because previous victims hadn't been able to gather the kind of comprehensive evidence that Emma and her legal team collected. This recognition of our investigative methods provided validation for the difficult months we'd spent secretly recording conversations and gathering evidence, while Linda continued her criminal activities. The techniques Rebecca Torres had taught us about surveillance and evidence collection had not only secured justice in our case, but were now helping other families protect themselves from similar exploitation. The broader impact of our case extended to academic research on family dynamics and elder abuse prevention. Criminology professors and social work researchers analyzed Linda's manipulation techniques to better understand how predators identify and exploit vulnerable elderly individuals. Dr. Sarah Chen, a criminologist at Portland State University, published a detailed case study of Linda's methods that became required reading in graduate courses on family violence and financial exploitation. Her analysis identified specific psychological techniques Linda had used to isolate Dad from our family and manipulate his perceptions about our motivations and concerns. Linda Rodriguez represents a particularly dangerous type of predator who combines psychological manipulation with sophisticated criminal planning, Dr. Chen wrote in her published research. Her systematic approach to identifying, grooming, and exploiting vulnerable men demonstrates the need for enhanced protection systems and public education about these types of crimes. This academic attention helped ensure that our experience would contribute to better understanding and prevention of similar crimes in the future. The pain and trauma Linda had inflicted on our family was being transformed into knowledge that could protect other families from experiencing similar exploitation. 2 years after Linda's sentencing, I received a letter from the daughter of one of her previous victims in California. Sarah Martinez had followed our case in the media and reached out to thank me for the courage to pursue justice despite the personal costs involved in confronting Linda's criminal enterprise. Watching your family fight back against the woman who destroyed my father's final years gave me hope that justice was possible, Sarah wrote. Your willingness to share your story publicly helped my family understand that we weren't alone and that the manipulation my father experienced wasn't his fault. Sarah's letter revealed that our case had inspired other victims' families to come forward with information about Linda's previous crimes, leading to additional charges and helping prosecutors build a more complete picture of her criminal career. The evidence we'd gathered had become the foundation for a broader investigation that provided closure for multiple families. These connections with other victims created a network of mutual support and shared understanding that helped all of us process the complex emotions surrounding Linda's crimes. We'd all experienced similar patterns of manipulation and loss, and we'd all struggled with questions about whether we could have done more to protect our loved ones from her exploitation. The guilt and self-doubt that victims' families experience is exactly what predators like Linda count on, explained Dr. Rachel Kim, a psychologist who specialized in supporting families affected by elder abuse. Connecting with other survivors helps people understand that the manipulation they witnessed was sophisticated and deliberate, not something they could have easily prevented or stopped. The support network that emerged from our case continued to provide resources and advocacy for families dealing with inheritance fraud and elder abuse. We organized annual gatherings where survivors could share their experiences, and newly affected families could learn about resources and strategies for protection and recovery. These meetings became platforms for education and advocacy that extended the impact of our individual case into broader social change. Participants shared information about warning signs of financial exploitation, legal resources for victims' families, and strategies for documentation and evidence gathering that could support future prosecutions. The Emma and Michael Rodriguez Cultural Center opened 3 years after Dad's death, housed in a beautifully renovated building in Portland's Alberta Arts District. The space combined a restaurant featuring our traditional family recipes with classrooms for cooking instruction, a performance area for cultural events, and a gallery displaying artwork from local Mexican-American artists. The opening celebration attracted hundreds of community members, including many people who had supported our family during the difficult period of Linda's criminal activities and legal proceedings. The event felt like a culmination of our recovery process and a new beginning for our family's mission of cultural preservation and community service. "This center represents everything that Linda tried to destroy," I said during the opening ceremony. "She wanted to eliminate our family's heritage and sell our legacy for personal profit. Instead, her crimes led us to create something even more meaningful and lasting than what she tried to steal." The Cultural Center's programs attracted families from throughout Portland's metropolitan area, including many people who had never experienced authentic Mexican-American cuisine or cultural traditions. Cooking classes filled up months in advance, with participants eager to learn traditional preparation techniques and understand the stories behind family recipes. Children's programs became especially popular, offering Spanish language instruction, traditional dance lessons, and educational activities about Mexican-American history and culture. Many families enrolled their children to help them connect with their heritage, while others participated to learn about their neighbors' traditions and build cross-cultural understanding. My grandmother's recipes are being taught to a new generation of families who will carry these traditions forward, Maria said during one of our cooking classes. Linda thought she could erase our heritage, but instead it's growing stronger and reaching more people than ever before. The success of the Cultural Center programs demonstrated the community hunger for authentic cultural education and connection that Linda had never understood during her attempts to modernize and mainstream our restaurants. People valued the opportunity to learn about traditions and participate in cultural preservation, not just consume simplified versions of ethnic food. Business operations at all 4 of our restaurant locations continued to thrive as our reputation for authentic cuisine and cultural programming attracted customers from throughout the Pacific Northwest. Food critics and travel writers began featuring our restaurants in articles about Portland's diverse culinary scene and the importance of family-owned establishments in preserving cultural traditions. The financial success of our expanded operations allowed us to increase wages for all employees, implement profit-sharing programs that gave staff members stakes in our continued success, and provide healthcare benefits that made our restaurants among the best employers in Portland's food service industry. "Working here feels like being part of a family that values our contributions and respects our cultural heritage," said Carlos, who had been promoted to assistant manager at our flagship location. "During Tyler's time as manager, we felt like replaceable workers who were supposed to follow orders without question. Now we're partners in preserving and sharing something meaningful." This transformation in employee relationships reflected broader changes in how we approached business operations and community engagement. Linda's criminal activities had been motivated by pure greed, viewing our restaurants as assets to be exploited for maximum short-term profit. Our approach focused on long-term sustainability and community impact that would preserve Dad's legacy for future generations. The scholarship program associated with the Cultural Center awarded its first grants 5 years after Dad's death, supporting 12 local students in their pursuit of careers related to culinary arts, cultural preservation, business management, and community development. The recipients represented diverse backgrounds and interests, united by their commitment to using their education for community benefit. These young people represent the future of cultural preservation and community building that my father always envisioned, I said during the scholarship award ceremony. Linda tried to steal from the next generation by destroying our family business, but instead her crimes led to expanded opportunities for young people to build better futures. The scholarship recipients participated in internship programs at our restaurants and cultural center, gaining practical experience while contributing to our educational and community outreach efforts. Many of them brought fresh perspectives and innovative ideas that helped us expand our programs and reach new audiences. One recipient, Maria Elena Gutierrez, used her scholarship to study nonprofit management and cultural program development. She eventually joined our staff full-time, developing educational curricula for the Cultural Center, and establishing partnerships with schools and community organizations throughout Portland. The Rodriguez family showed me that businesses can be vehicles for cultural preservation and community empowerment, Maria Elena explained. Linda's attempt to destroy their legacy inspired me to dedicate my career to helping other families protect and share their heritage. These partnerships and educational initiatives extended our impact far beyond our immediate restaurant operations, creating networks of cultural preservation and community development that touched thousands of families throughout Portland. The Cultural Center became a model for other family businesses interested in expanding their community impact while maintaining their commercial success. Reflecting on the 7 years that have passed since Linda's crimes were exposed and prosecuted, I'm struck by how her attempt to destroy our family ultimately led to expansion and strengthening of everything she'd tried to eliminate. Her greed and cruelty revealed the depth of community support for cultural preservation and family businesses that she'd never understood or appreciated. The restaurants continue to serve authentic Mexican-American cuisine that honors our grandmother's recipes while adapting to contemporary tastes and dietary preferences. The Cultural Center hosts programs that introduce Mexican-American traditions to new generations while preserving knowledge and techniques that might otherwise be lost. The scholarship program supports young people who are committed to using their education for community benefit rather than personal enrichment. Linda remains in federal prison, serving her 25-year sentence with no possibility of parole. Occasionally, I receive updates about her status from law enforcement officials, but mostly she's become a footnote in our story, rather than a central character. Her crimes created trauma and loss that affected our family profoundly, but they didn't define our future or determine our legacy. The most important lesson from our experience is that justice is possible when families are prepared to document criminal behavior systematically and pursue legal remedies despite personal costs and emotional challenges. Linda's sophisticated manipulation and criminal enterprise seemed overwhelming when we were living through it, but careful preparation and community support enabled us to expose her crimes and recover what she'd stolen. Your family's victory demonstrates that love and determination can triumph over greed and manipulation, Detective Santos said during a recent law enforcement training session where she presented our case as an example of successful prosecution. Linda thought she could destroy your father's legacy and steal your heritage, but instead her crimes led to expansion and strengthening of everything she'd tried to eliminate. This perspective helps me understand our experience as part of a larger story about community resilience and cultural preservation that extends far beyond our individual family. Dad's legacy isn't just preserved in our restaurants and cultural center, but in the networks of support and education that emerged from our struggle against Linda's criminal enterprise. Sometimes I encounter people who remember the dark period when Linda controlled our operations and comment on how much stronger and more successful everything appears now. These conversations remind me that recovery and renewal are visible to our community, demonstrating that families can overcome even sophisticated criminal schemes when they maintain commitment to their values and receive support from people who understand what's at stake. The most profound transformation has been personal, moving from the fear and confusion Linda created through systematic poisoning and manipulation to confidence and clarity about our family's mission and values. The woman who tried to destroy me through pharmaceutical abuse ultimately revealed strength and determination that I hadn't known I possessed. Standing in the kitchen of our cultural center this morning, teaching a cooking class about traditional enchilada preparation while surrounded by families eager to learn about Mexican-American heritage, I think about how Dad would feel about what we've accomplished. Linda's attempt to steal his legacy led to its expansion and preservation in ways that honor his memory while serving future generations. The restaurants thrive, the cultural center flourishes, and the scholarship program supports young people who are building better futures for themselves and their communities. Linda's crimes created pain and trauma that we'll never forget, but they didn't prevent us from creating something even more meaningful than what she'd tried to destroy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.